Hey everybody, what's up? This is Garrett. I'm here with another video about New York City's history. Now we're going to be taking the time, well, I hope you take the time, I certainly took it, to be discussing what is without a doubt the darkest chapter in the city's history. And that's no small statement given the city's 400 plus years in existence. I'm talking about a time where moods were low and anxieties were high. I'm talking about a time when the politicians were incompetent or corrupt. I'm talking about a time where nobody had any money, and the money they did have had lost its value. A time when there was racial tensions. A time when people were afraid of being killed in the street. Talking about a time when everybody that had the means just picked up and left everybody else at the bottom to fend for themselves. And no, I am not talking about COVID. Now, if you're young, you might think that we're living through the worst chapter. I mean, in your life, perhaps, yes. But man, if you come to visit New York City, as bad as they say it is on the news, stop an old man on the street, an old man who's been here his whole life. And you know what he'll say to you? You say, "Mister, are things really that bad?" And he'll say, "Nah, it's not that bad." I mean, it's not like it's the 1970s.
And it's going, it has 15, 10, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 seconds. Happy New Year! Goodbye to the 60s, decade of descent, and welcome to the giant mystery that is the 1970s.
Ah, the 1970s. The days when the velvet was crushed, and so were the dreams. A decade marred by ups and downs, and downers and uppers. All the biggest dreamers of the post-war age had either been lost to their limits, or lost to, well...
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
It was an era of mass distraction, a sweat-soaked hangover from the fevered dreams of limitless post-war American expansion. An age of cheap date promises of NASA moon colonies, nuclear energy, and material wealth at any cost but high prices. The old culture of idealism gave way to a vapid and shameless, never-ending forget-your-troubles dance party. The fashion was excessive and synthetic, as if clothing itself was an advertisement for a new America, inspired by its own insincerity and naked selfishness. The free love of the hippies brought nothing but heartache, exploitation, addiction, STDs, and ultimately AIDS. The war in Vietnam did nothing but embitter the formerly idealistic enlisted, as young men were drafted to bring democratic government to the people of a land they didn't know or care about, in order to spread the ideals of a nation they hardly felt beneficiaries of. Upon their return to an unappreciative public, many found themselves addicted and unable to cope or reintegrate, and were disregarded as damaged souls.
To keep myself going through the day in combat, I would get high. I would be under the influence of some type of drugs, and I wouldn't feel fear.
The nuclear threats of the Cold War fostered a nihilistic defeatism, and postmodern theory gained traction in universities, and the educated were adopting new worldviews of zero-sum games, not among lines of morality, but among naked power flexes and narrative control, as scandal further eroded the public's waning trust in its own government.
To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
The gold-backed money of the 60s was now the free-floating, inflated green paper of the 70s, tied to nothing but the whims of elite bankers. The unlimited gas and affordable cars of the 60s gave us the smothering smog of the 70s, and the OPEC gas crisis, which made driving unaffordable. The answer to the problem came from Japan in the form of compact and efficient, reliable cars, while EPA-regulated American car manufacturers continued to pump out bloated, power-starved, emissions-choked land yachts that Americans hated and couldn't even afford, with the Big Three opting for a target market of aging World War II country club veterans on the assumption that American brand loyalty superseded their economic reality, doubling down on an illusory message that America, like their cars, was bigger and more luxurious than ever. The people called it the malaise era. In reality, everything was either stagnating or receding, most notably their purchasing power. It seemed nothing in America was going right in the 70s, so you may as well just blow a line and forget your troubles, because none of us are getting out of this mess alive when the Soviets drop their nukes. And of all the powerful American symbols to define us in our meteoric 20th century ascension to world power status, none of them suffered a humiliation so great as did the city of New York. So let's join a cult and raise a Kool-Aid toast to an era when the Big Apple was the Big Apple core. In the movie Death Wish, Charles Bronson plays a financially secure property developer living in Manhattan's Upper West Side, who sees all around him the societal collapse of New York. His personal life, however, is idyllic, despite a son-in-law who has squandered his sense of masculinity in service to a new social paradigm of passivity in an observably deteriorating world. His insulated life, however, is obliterated when on one afternoon his wife and daughter are followed home from the grocery store and brutally attacked by a gang led by Jeff Goldblum. Is that Jeff Goldblum? Resulting in the death of his wife and the psychological paralysis of his daughter. Under the weight of his loss, he loses himself in his work, and after returning from a job out west, he is gifted a handgun from his client, after which Charles Bronson goes full Charles Bronson on the criminal world he sees around him. Eventually, the police are on to him, but rather than bring him to justice, they tacitly offer him a way out of responsibility if he would please just stop. The film is, by today's standards, a low-budget B-movie thrill spectacle, but as an historical artifact, it has proved a masterpiece. Similarly, in Taxi Driver, Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, an aimless veteran with no prospects, no support structure, and a growing resentment of the artificial veneer of progress betrayed by rampant evidence of evil, opportunism, enslavement, and the passivity of those who tolerate it. He feels compelled to rage against it. To understand New York in the 1970s, one need only see these movies. Together, these films display characters who manifest the macroscopic anxieties and frustrations inherent in the populace in the city in the 70s. The American dream was getting increasingly harder to maintain by those in higher income brackets, and to those at the bottom, seemed like nothing but another bill of goods sold to a public growing ever more hopeless as the bottom rungs of the ladder were pulled higher and higher, inch by inch, day by day. When World War II ended and vets from New York City returned to their cramped urban dwellings, the U.S. government offered them an opportunity to embrace a new mobilized nation of victors. Buy a car, live in a nice house, away from the noise of the city. Take your mother, take your grandmother with you while you're at it. Be the success story your grandmother dreamed of when she immigrated from Eastern Europe in 1898. Up until then, only the rich could afford to live beyond the city in their secluded estates. But by the 1950s, everyone was going to be rich. Everyone was going to have their own stately dwelling. However, to do these things, to buy a spacious house, To buy that new car, you need money. And some 23-year-old veteran whose only life experience was killing Germans and dodging 88s in a foxhole wasn't necessarily a skill that was any longer in high demand. The U.S. government came to the rescue, though, through the GI Bill.
Pretty nice, huh? After all, $100 is a lot of bucks.
I'm not complaining, so far. But changing over from a GI to a civilian costs money. By the time a guy has bought himself a new outfit and looked around, trying to remember his saluting days are over, most of his dough is pretty well shot.
The United States Employment Service has 1,500 offices throughout the country with a special Veterans Employment Representative to assist ex-soldiers in finding the right job.
The GI Bill was a social program that offered initiatives to veterans to expand their skill sets with free education and job opportunities like building roads and highways and laying the infrastructure of a new post-urban landscape.
Suburbia was born. 500,000 homes sprang up around the country in 1946. Nearly 1 million in 1947. 1 million in 1948. Still more in 1949.
With these jobs, they would make enough money to buy those houses, to have an American-made car and drive on those very roads with. They built schools to educate the boom of babies they were having, and they built shopping malls to spend all their newly earned money in, and fill their homes with newer and shinier objects made for cheaper prices elsewhere to assure themselves of their newfound status. Those families by the 1950s could sit back and watch their brand new television sets comfortably and say to their children, "Do you see this house, Jimmy? Do you see these roads, these schools, these cars, this life? We built that so that you could ride your bike unattended on the quiet and safe streets that we didn't have growing up." And little Jimmy sat peacefully on the living room carpet, his eyes fixed to the TV, dreaming of being an astronaut one day, if not a cowboy. When the economically mobilized went beyond the city to the suburbs, they took their tax dollars with them. The neighborhoods of New York City depleted, and others soon followed to chase the same white picket fence dream. Businesses in the city started noticing less customers and began to close. By the early 1960s, those who hadn't left already were met with what Robert Moses called the meat axe. The depleted city could now be carved to pieces and reinvented in the image of mass transit through eminent domain laws.
Congestion has brought to thickly populated areas has stimulated planners to redesign whole urban areas in city after city. These planners recognize the vital importance of the expressways, many to be a part of the interstate system, in improving, strengthening, and renewing old, worn-out parts of the city. In many areas, slums have been cleared to provide right-of-way for the construction of attractive, modern expressways.
If you hadn't left the old neighborhood by now, they were prepared to kick you out. Tear down the old unattended church and put in a parking lot for the commuter who might come into town to do business and leave. New York City had earned its reputation in the 19th century as a manufacturing town, pumping out everything from Oreo cookies to textiles to envelopes, musical instruments, children's toys, even refined sugar. But by 1964, Detroit was the heart of America's new manufacturing initiative: cars. And everything once made cheaply in New York was now so strangled with regulation and mob interference that manufacturers too sought greener and cheaper pastures and began leaving. In part, New York's own geography had doomed it. Whereas once New York's waterfront was its greatest asset, making it the greatest trade hub in the world, by the era of highways, trucking would outpace freight, and commercial aviation would bankrupt rail travel. So, ports began to close, and railroad companies began to scale back operations. And now all these new bridges and tunnels to access New York were expensive obstacles. Now the Oreo cookies would be shipped into New York and not shipped from it. And when Penn Station was torn down in 1965, everyone in New York knew that the New York of old was not coming back. What remained of New York, however, was its reputation in the financial sector and in media and communications technology. In the 1960s, Governor Rockefeller had big dreams to revive the once great city with the construction of the world's largest buildings, a massive 16-acre World Trade Center complex. It would cement the reputation of the city's best economic stronghold, finance. But acquiring the capital would not be easy, and a deal was made with New Jersey to partner up and bring it to the west side so that PATH trains could link directly to New Jersey suburbs where the employees would live and pay property tax there. So despite these grand twin towers, New York's own communities benefited minimally. The World Trade Center opened in 1973, but by then the reality of what New York had become was all too clear. No one wanted to live in this city when all of the blessings of a better American life were outside of its cramped grid. No one wanted to stay in the city and raise a family and educate their kids in the worst schools in America. Only the upper class were insulated in their stately townhouses. The lower classes were immobilized, and the middle class, well, they were gone. Abraham Beame took office as mayor in 1974. He was the first practicing Jew to ever hold the position. He had spent his early career in an accounting firm and became the city's budget director in 1952 and held the position for 9 years. In the 60s, he became comptroller and later ran unsuccessfully for mayor in 1966, despite the endorsement of Robert Kennedy. In his 1973 run, however, he leveraged his accounting and budget experience and ran on a financial responsibility platform and won. His entire administration, however, was doomed to failure. The Titanic was now more than halfway under, and no amount of bailing water was going to save it.
A series of municipal bonds has been issued to try to raise cash. There's little confidence in them, though they're being pushed hard by the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or Big Mac as it's been dubbed. Wall Street, the big banks, traditional backers of New York, have cried enough. They've stopped lending to the city, a foretaste of the financial repercussions likely if New York's economy can't be revived.
Well, the basic problem is that New York has been spending more than it has been receiving by way of taxation for some years, and has been borrowing to cover the shortfall. The problem now is that people will no longer lend to the city to cover this shortfall because they really don't think they will be repaid. At the present time, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which is a body that has been set up to assist the city, is going to make available $2.3 billion in funds to help the city repay its loans. However, by December the 10th, or just earlier, that amount of money will have been used up. At that point, when any loan repayments become due, if no other help is forthcoming, the city will simply have to say that it is unable to meet the payments of principal and interest when they fall due, and that will be the default.
By 1974, New York City officials woke up and realized that the tax base was gone. It had not the revenue on hand to meet its most basic municipal needs, so the city hired less cops. But overworking existing servicemen would mean paying overtime, money the city didn't have. So they actively began laying them off. The FDNY, the busiest fire department in the world, saw its funding slashed, and despite less men and equipment, they were expected to put out more fires, most of which were insurance scams and serial arsonists. The practice of burning out a building was so common, you couldn't even get fire insurance on buildings in the Bronx by 1977, and what insurance you could get was prohibitively expensive, making building sales an impossibility. The Bronx burned uninterrupted, and the fire department often simply stood by and watched. In 1975, the city laid off 10,000 sanitation workers, and those still on the job routinely saw their checks bounce.
How has the financial crisis affected your work?
My work? I lost all faith in the job. How can you work, and you don't know whether you're going to get paid on Friday? 2 weeks ago, they stopped the checks. They wouldn't pay some of the men. We were fortunate. We got our checks cashed at 9 o'clock. But the guys that were cashing them in the afternoon, they didn't know whether they'd have money to pay the bonds. And I don't know, how can you work? You work a week and then don't know whether you're going to get paid at the end of the week. The guy that I have to pay my bills to, the grocer, he wants his money. He's not going to wait. So I don't know, it's going to be hard to say. I lost all morale on the job.
So when you get a check now, you cash it at once, do you?
As soon as the bank opens, yeah. It's like a gamble, you know. Are they going to have the money or are they not going to have the money?
Later that year, garbage men went on strike, and the garbage piled in the streets. In 1976, the mayor came to the federal government with his hat in his hands, begging for spare change. At first, President Gerald Ford shunned the city, refusing to provide federal aid, and that New York is responsible for cleaning its own mess.
Substantial sentiment for any legislation of one kind or another in the Congress to bail out New York City. So I think it's very premature to make any comment other than nothing I've seen so far seems to fit the bill.
But after cabinet meetings and deliberation, it was determined that if New York fell into complete ruins, it would cascade a domino effect of bankruptcies across all the deteriorating cities of America. So New York was put officially on a federal allowance, a fiscal methadone, just enough to keep the city alive, all courtesy of the American taxpayer. If the city can't afford to pay the cops, the firemen, or the garbage collectors, it most certainly couldn't afford to prune the trees or mow the grass. Central Park, a once proud living monument to the civic ideals of the city, had become no more than an overgrown maze of hiding spots for deviants waiting to snatch your purse or wallet, if not your life. The woodland section of the park, known as the Ramble, had become a clandestine drug market, and rumors and whisperings of what lurked in the night created great apprehension among locals and visitors alike. The great urban luxury was now the great urban liability. It wouldn't be until the 1980s that the private-public partnership, known as the Central Park Conservancy, would gain legitimacy, and not until the 1990s that the Conservancy would be able to sustain the park's $75 million annual budget through charity alone. The subway system, known as the MTA, was barely functional in the 70s. Trains were always delayed, unventilated, and foul-smelling. While colorful murals began to appear as vibrant decorations over the otherwise drab and aging trains, graffiti was for the public at large not a welcome outlet for the creative and resilient spirit of the youth, but an overwhelming reminder of the failure of the city to maintain order. The graffiti was the least of their concerns, however. Crime in the subway was so rampant, and the police so understaffed, that by the end of the decade, the public began taking matters into their own hands.
When the sun goes down and the rush of the day is over, it becomes a different world. With an average of only one cop for about every 2,000 paying passengers, the transit police are hard-pressed to do the job. At one point, they were trying to cope with more than 200 serious crimes, felonies, each week. The situation outraged 23-year-old Curtis Sliwa, the night manager at a McDonald's restaurant, and he hit upon the idea of citizen patrols to look for and interrupt subway crimes. Soon, the red beret and T-shirt uniform of the Magnificent 13 started becoming familiar to riders as 3 4-man teams took to the trains each night.
They were originally known as the Magnificent 13, later known as the Guardian Angels. Their founder, Curtis Sliwa, has since survived assassination attempts, has run for mayor, and to this day remains an active advocate for order and responsibility. When the Magnificent 13 patrolled the trains, the public were divided on the meaning of their presence in the stations and trains. With no official authority, they acted as self-appointed cops, thwarting opportunities for criminals to take advantage. Some saw them as an embarrassing sign of the failure of the city to provide for its own citizens. Others saw them as a positive force, a manifestation of the unrelenting spirit of the people to provide for themselves.
They help one old lady, it's worthwhile. They help one person, that's all it needs. Save one person from being mugged or hurt seriously, it's well worth it. Maybe you get a lot more people would take action. Right now, if a 90-year-old woman was being mugged on a train, 9 out of 10 passengers, they turn their head and they look the other way.
The Magnificent 13 is wrong. It's not the right thing. They're not professionals.
If we're not doing it with weapons, if we're paying our way on, if we're law-abiding citizens, It gives me the right, because if the authorities cannot deal with these people, if they continue to give us excuses why this thing exists and keep growing, crime is on a spiraling rate, then we ourselves as normal citizens, honest, hardworking citizens, have to do something. I'm not just going to sit home and let this situation get totally out of hand. I love my city, and I'm going to do something about it.
In the 70s, Times Square, the Great White Way, the crossroads of the world, had become an open-air drug and flesh market. The golden age of live theater entertainment had given way to burlesque and peep shows, porn shops, pimps, dope, and runaways who arrived on buses at the nearby Port Authority. The pimps made the Port Authority bus terminal their unofficial headquarters, waiting for desperate runaways to arrive and offering them steady employment. Theaters like the New Amsterdam Theater had once been home to highbrow Shakespeare productions and Ziegfeld Follies vaudeville acts. But by the 1970s, it was reduced to showing double features of kung fu movies for $1 per view. Addicts would often attend matinees just to have a quiet hiding place to use. By the end of the 1970s, there had been 2 stabbings and a security guard killed in a botched box office robbery at the theater. When the theater finally closed, most of the ornate plaster and terracotta moldings had long since chipped and fallen away from the walls. It sat idle for the next decade until Disney bought it in the 90s. Today it's home to Aladdin. In Greenwich Village, subversive lifestyles proliferated. In the East Village and Alphabet City, punk rock found an audience of disaffected teenagers, their very clothing a reflection of their environment. That environment, combined with the energy of youth, made it a cauldron for a new wave of talent to emerge, a pre-MTV youth that found in their dirty surroundings inspiration and beauty. Clubs like CBGB's would operate as a launching pad for artists like the Talking Heads, Blondie, the Police, the Beastie Boys, the Misfits, and the Ramones, among others. In the 1970s, a gay man could live his entire life in the closet until he got to the social club on Friday night, where the mafia could profit off his need for privacy and discretion. It was at the time still illegal to serve alcohol to homosexuals, and the Gay Liberation Front, despite all their marches and protests, were at the mercy of mobsters like Fat Tony Loria, who operated gay clubs as private social clubs, circumventing the cabaret laws. Bottle bars, as they were known, meant you could bring your own booze. The main income was through entry fees. Bribed cops would tip off club operators to impending raids, and cues like flickering lights were a universally understood message to get out of the club and back in the closet. What the city couldn't afford to do, the mafia could. They flagrantly extorted local businesses in the wake of the city's failures, under the threat of property damage, bodily injury, or worse. The mafia, in its golden age, was run like a congress of strict Catholic men who operated on rigid moral codes of honor and conduct. They called their order the Commission. Among their rules was not to involve themselves in the running of highly addictive and deadly narcotics, choosing instead to deal in loan sharking, protection rackets, price fixing, insurance scams, fencing merchandise, and waste hauling. If the mafia could be described generously, they were a mosquito sucking the blood of legal enterprises. They fostered local support by giving back to the very communities they stole from, ingratiating themselves to future jurors. By the mid-70s, however, the drug trade, with profit margins of 1,000% returns, proved an opportunity they couldn't refuse. While the Colombo crime family, by now led from behind bars by Carmine Persico, controlled the underworld, their narcotics trade was the bread and butter of the Lucchese family, who teamed up across racial lines with Harlem drug traffickers known as the Council, led by Nicky Barnes, for a lucrative heroin enterprise. Initially, the drug trafficking into New York from the 1930s onward operated on a westbound international trade route from poppy-producing countries like Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. The raw materials were smuggled to Syria and Lebanon, then Turkey, then shipped to Corsica, where the controlling French mafia sent it to Marseille. This is where they refined it into heroin and then shipped it to the USA, often packed into cars sent on freight. This operation would become known as the French Connection. But by 1972, the operation was taken apart when bribed servicemen sent alarms up the chain of command. The FBI then tipped off the NYPD, who worked in tandem in a sting operation. When the French Connection fell apart, it left a gaping hole in the narcotics market. Over the next years, budget cuts decimated the NYPD, who became ever easier to bribe. Many had lost their respect for the job. The mafia would pay 3 times their yearly salary in a single month, if not more. Frank Serpico, however, was not your ordinary cop. He seemed a misfit idealist in a department made cynical and jaded. Serpico's refusal to take bribes made him a threat that would be alleviated if he were to accidentally die on the job. And after a failed assassination attempt, he gained the attention he needed to break the story, and the NYPD's reputation and trust among the public was ruined for the next 30 years.
Is that not just heroin and other drugs, but jewelry, money, even weapons, all evidence in criminal cases, is missing from this building, the Police Department Property Office. Police official told ABC News that he warned both the past commissioner and the present one of the poor security, but nothing changed. We have also learned that the stealing is not confined to just a handful of policemen, but involves many. The New York City Police Department, thought by many to be this country's finest, hasn't even been able to guard its own front door.
The state of the embarrassment, as well as the financial hardships of the NYPD, saw the 1974 closure of the police headquarters, an institution which had been stationed in Little Italy since 1909, put there as a message to the rapidly expanding Italian black market underworld that the weight of the police force was heavier than that of the mafia. But by 1974, it was gone, and the mafia were stronger than ever. The building has since been converted into luxury apartments. In 1975, travelers arriving in New York City airports would be handed a free survival guide pamphlet that read, "Welcome to Fear City." They were handed out in protest by uniformed servicemen, livid at the budget cuts to the NYPD, despite growing crime. That year closed out with over 1,500 murders on record. The people of New York partied like the world was coming to an end. By the late 70s, heroin was out and cocaine was in. The summer of 1977 was the hottest of the decade. Things were brought to a boil when a series of random murders of young couples and lone brunette women began to appear in the newscasts. A killer was now on the loose, stalking young women and killing them in a perplexing and unpredictable pattern across the 5 boroughs.
The general description that we have is of a male, white, 25 to 30 years of age, 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet in height, medium build.
He approached the 2 girls and attempted to engage them in a conversation, at which time the girls decided there was something wrong with this guy. They wanted to go into the house, and the man all of a sudden started firing.
Christine Froon, 26 years old, soon to be married, is dead today. Dead in a shooting that has no apparent motive. And dead, perhaps just because, by chance, her boyfriend, John Deal, had to park 4 blocks away from the movie theater they were visiting.
A quiet street. 2 young people sitting in a parked car on Lover's Lane. Then, without warning or motive, the sudden, brutal attack.
18-year-old Valentina Suriani and her steady boyfriend, 20-year-old Alexander Esau, were parked in his car on the Hutchinson River Parkway Service Road. At 3 a.m., 3 shots tore through the side window of the car.
They killed a girl again. For the year, I never hear those things. What happened now? What's changed? We need protection. We are paying taxes.
People began looking over their shoulders. Women began dyeing their hair blonde. People avoided going out at night. He would be known as the .44 caliber killer. And after he began sending cryptic and taunting letters to the police, he would come to be known infamously by his moniker, the Son of Sam.
Police transported David Berkowitz from headquarters to Brooklyn Central Booking. After, my sources say, he confessed to being the 44 killer. After he told them he was a killing machine, ordered by a voice speaking through a neighbor's dog to carry out his bloody outrages against young pretty women. Police discovered in his car the .44 Bulldog revolver and a Thompson submachine gun. I'm told Berkowitz planned to use the revolver again and again until he felt police were getting close. Then he decided to take the .45 caliber machine gun, commit mass murder at a Long Island disco, and fight it out with Suffolk police in a blaze of glory.
The tension in the city was palpable. There was garbage everywhere. A killer on the loose, 12% unemployment. There were racial tensions, brazen criminals prowling the streets, and fewer police to catch them. New York was a powder keg about to explode, and all it would take was a spark.
The sound of I guess it must have been 1,000 voices, just at a scream of exultation. I don't know, really. And I said to Belle, my wife, the lights are out, and I think there's going to be hell to pay tonight.
Con Edison called it an act of God when lightning took out a Westchester County pylon. Mayor Beam blamed Con Edison for failure to prepare. Whoever's fault it was, when the blackout of 1977 occurred, it was under an hour before the rioting and looting began. While officials pointed fingers at each other, the people of New York hid in dark, cramped rooms with no air conditioning during the hottest month of the hottest year. Those who dared go outside were left to fend for themselves. The looting and the burning tore apart what was left of the already blighted blocks of Brooklyn and the Bronx. And there was no money or incentive to put these neighborhoods back together. The blackout symbolized a city that had completely fallen apart, sent back to a primitive age where primitive impulses prevail. When the lights came back on, the people of New York had had enough. They had seen a rock bottom and needed to change. In the next year, they elected a centrist Democrat who ran a law and order-focused grassroots campaign to return New York to its former glory.
Hi, everybody.
His name was Ed Koch. His popularity earned him 3 consecutive terms, his second term gaining him both the Republican and Democratic nominations, winning him 74% of the vote. He instituted austerity measures, hired the first black police commissioner, Benjamin Ward, and he gave the police broader powers. The larger American perception of New York was at this time dim. No one wanted to visit. No one wanted to invest. In 1978, however, the I Heart NY campaign would slowly rebrand New York as a destination for arts and entertainment, and not a city to build a wall around. By the 80s, corporate investment into New York would slowly return, and Wall Street would boom under Ronald Reagan, and developers like Donald Trump would pioneer the mixed-use zoning style that is today the standard. Then came Disney in the 90s, overtaking Times Square. Then came Giuliani in '94. Then came the internet. Then came Starbucks. And we all lived happily ever after, until 9/11. When the 70s ended, New York was still in the gutter. It was going to take a long time to get out. But the people knew they had already been through the worst of it. No event or circumstance could possibly dim the lights of a generation any darker than was the blackout.
Former Beatle John Lennon is dead. He was shot a short time ago outside his Manhattan apartment building. He died at Roosevelt Hospital. Police have a suspect in custody.
Former Beatle John Lennon murdered in New York.
This afternoon, before the rain began, a crowd of as many as 2,000 people came out here.
Police speculate that Chapman arrived in New York last week. He had begun to stalk Lennon from his room here at the West 63rd Street Y.
Roseanne, they are the young, they are the middle-aged, they are the people who didn't even know him.
Perhaps it's a fitting way to close out the decade. He was not quite a martyr, but a last fallen pillar of the old world, here now eternalized in the music and in the sealed aspirations gathering dust in the attics of our memory. Well, there you have it. As promised, a video about New York in the 1970s. I hope, if anything, it's given you a little bit of perspective that we should be celebrating the good fortunes we have to keep, rather than despairing the hardships that we face. Anyway, it's been real. I hope to see you in the next one. Be sure to leave the like and to subscribe, and, well, you know. I'll see you.